Right. Sorry, this is not a security talk. So, my name's Tokala, and I have a problem, mainly with outdated technology, particularly phones. So I'm not talking about the old phones, the wired things. I'm just talking about like old smartphones that have kind of come to the end of their life. And I like to be able to try and repurpose them, or at the very least kind of get that extra little bit of mileage out of them. Unfortunately, I have an enabler. So I have a friend who works in a charity that recycles electronic devices. So every so often he lets me go throughout the back and scrounge through the bits and pieces and find things. So one day I found this phone. Now, it was still in the box, opened it up, it had all the accessories still packaged up. It was all still even this little wee cellophane baggie. So I clicked Google and it found that, it actually does still have an upgrade path. So I paid him far too much money and it was mine. The dreaded Nokia Lumia 1520. Okay, so it was released in 2013, and this one was actually made in 2013, which makes it about 9 years old, and in phone years, that's 90 years. It had the operating system, Windows Mobile 8, 6-inch screen, massive 2 gigs of RAM, absolutely stunning. But it actually had some quite cool features for its age. It had wireless charging, over-the-air updates, and supposedly you could play games on it. So just a little bit about Windows Mobile. So a lot of people think Windows Mobile is actually CE. It's not. CE is the embedded operating system designed for when you want a device not to work properly. Windows Mobile is actually based off the NT kernel. So that's the same as your modern applications for things like Windows 10, etc. NT actually stands for New Technology, which it was 20 years ago. The idea was Microsoft wanted to make an operating system ecosystem where a developer could write a piece of software for a desktop machine, could be relatively easily ported across onto a mobile device, basically just changing the UI. It didn't really get the uptake that they wanted, so eventually they decided to get rid of it. Right, so the quick Google says that this phone could support Windows 10. But because it was actually originally started with Windows 8.0, I then had to go to 8.1 and then to 10. So as you can see there, arguably 8.0 and 8.1 are the two of the best operating systems that Microsoft ever put out, bar ME. Right. So I did a massive amount of Googling trying to find the upgrade software, etc. And because it's so old, all the links sent you back to a Microsoft website that was now dead. So eventually I found some software, downloaded it, it was a bit dodgy, put it through all the systems, put it through VirusTotal, okay, I'll install it on my machine. So I installed it, started the upgrade process, so it found the upgrade software, great. Downloaded Windows 8, flashed, wiped the flash, and then there was an error. And actually, that's what it said. There was an error. That's it. It's dead. This phone is now dead. So I thought, I've owned it 2 hours. I paid far too much money for this phone, and now it's dead. So I spent an awful lot of time Googling, trying to find options on what it could do. Even when you plug the phone into your laptop, it just comes up as an unknown device. The magic button combination didn't work. So eventually in the forums, and I hate forums, but in the forums it said, disconnect the battery. So these things is not a removable battery on this particular thing. So disassemble the phone, remove the battery, plug it back in, actually it booted. So it was actually caught in a boot loop. But now all I had was a bootloader. I didn't have an operating system, just a straight bootloader. So a little bit more Googling and I found some other offline tools, started to play around with it, the command line tools. And what I realized what had happened was it had wiped the ID of the phone. So with this particular hardware, Microsoft, Nokia itself was actually quite good. No matter where in the world you use this phone, it was the same hardware. All it was the actual config was different inside the phone. So the radio equipment in there could actually be used anywhere in the world. So the ID specified which image you were about to load onto your phone. Without this ID on there, the system just said, no, can't install. I had the wonderful idea, let's go into the image file I have, edit it, it's only hex, remove the value for the model of phone, but then I found that the actual image is assigned, so as soon as you try and put it back in, the software goes, boop, nope, not going to do it. Okay, so I talked to a friend and kind of said, well, what am I going to do with this phone, because, it owes me money. So he suggested, well, let's actually pull it apart and see what's going on. So first of all, we started to pull it apart. So this is what basically the inside of the phone. So we started to tear it down, and this is the main motherboard. As you can see, there's little tin boxes. They are like little Faraday cages. So underneath them is the main processor and the memory and everything for the thing. They're earthed. The idea is that no radio waves are going to get in there and interfere with the chip. So it's okay for it to radiate your head. It's not okay for it to radiate itself. So then the first thing we needed to do was identify where the flash was. So one option is you could just pull little tin boxes off, but we wanted to reuse this phone, and by doing that, you're going to wreck them. So we decided to X-ray it. Now, the main reason we wanted to X-ray it is because we have an X-ray. If you own an X-ray, you have to X-ray things. And I can assure you, there's been a lot of nights of beer, pizza, and X-raying stuff done. So this particular one is actually an old dental X-ray. And it would have been quite scary because you sat in the machine and it spun around and took an X-ray of your head. And it was kind of like the old-fashioned, there was no limit switches, so if you moved, it would take your head off while it was X-raying you. So what we did is we modified it so that it no longer spins, it just points straight in one direction. And originally it was designed to have film, so really expensive, really hard to process. So we modified it to run the X-ray plates, the same as a relatively modern X-ray system does. So the little grey box that's in there is actually an X-ray plate. And once you've taken your X-ray, you put the plate into what looks like a giant inkjet printer. It reads it out, puts it into a computer, gives you a nice little printout, and then you can wipe the plate again and reuse it. So it's actually cost effective. So the little arrow there shows what we identified as we thought was the flash. Now the reason is because just the number of pins, and we actually already knew where it was, so we were just X-raying things. Yeah. So sure enough, there's the flash. So we pulled the little cover off nice and carefully. Samsung flash. So Samsung flash, 32 gigs of storage. This is the operating system and your user data. So what's this say? You don't need any more than 64 megs. Okay. This is kind of the same sort of thing. So the chip is relatively small, 11 mil by 13 mil. It's what's called BGA. So this is ball grid array. And there's another word I was going to use and I won't. So all the little round circles there, each one of those is a solder point. So when it's soldered onto the board, each of those make a connection. Not all of them are used, but they're all actually there. So just to give you an idea how big this chip actually is, it's a 10-cent piece. 10-cent piece is about 20 millimeters in diameter, and the chip is 11 to 13, and the other picture there is with a biro next to it. So the first thing you want to do is you want to take this chip off the board, which is not an easy feat because it's soldered underneath. So the way we do that is a combination of heat, radiant heat from the bottom and hot air from the top. So we put a little tray there, heats up to about 90 to 100 degrees just before the solder's supposed to mount, and then we use a hot air blast to actually blast the chip and lift it off. So that all went relatively smoothly. So we had our chip in our hot little hands then. The next thing is trying to read the data off the chip. So we managed to get an adapter which takes for the flash memory into a standard EEPROM reader. So if anybody's familiar with playing with chips, your little EEPROM reader, the reader itself is relatively cheap, but the holder is a few $100s because they're a highly precision device. So after 40 minutes, we had a 32 gig file, so I shouldn't really be calling it flash anymore because it ain't that fast. So what we then did is I started going through the hex files, now my happy space in hex files. And what I was hoping for was a little read thing that says, Darren, put the device ID back in here and all will be good. But no, couldn't find it. What I did find was there's 3 separate partitions in the 32 gigs, the boot, main operating system, and then the user area. So I spent quite a bit of time pouring through all this, but yeah, to no avail. It was no good. So back to Google. Then I found that AliExpress was going to come to my rescue, where I could buy a second-hand board from China, and the price is about what the whole phone's worth, and that's significantly less than what I paid for the phone. So this was a working board, so after a few weeks it arrived, installed it into the phone, booted up to make sure it worked, and sure enough, booted up, Windows 10, Chinese Windows 10, the region was anyway, so not a big issue, but all the certificates expired, so it was a completely useless phone. I think they had a desktop. That was about it. So went through, reflashed it. Actually, this time I used a different set of tools and was able to flash it back down to in Windows 8.1, cool, and then up to 10, and it actually started to work. This is the point that I found out that Microsoft had turned off the store for Windows Mobile in 2018, so you can't install any software onto it. There's one good feature though, you can actually sideload, so you can put it into a debug mode and then you have a browser interface which kind of gives you like your task manager style on a normal desktop, as well as you can sideload applications. I downloaded a whole pile of applications to find that they were so old they just didn't work anymore. So I had this phone in my hand, so it's kind of completely useless as it's running, but I thought that's really, really boring. Why don't we try and get the old original board running again? So the idea was we'll pull the flash off this board, read it out, then reflash my original chip, put my original chip back on my original motherboard, and put the whole thing back together. And this is where the learning began. So in order to put the chip back on, we have to actually resolder it on. So what we use is called a stencil. So the pictures there, the stencil on the left is what a normal CPU stencil would be. So like a car computer chip or something like that. The one on the right is what we're dealing with. So it's quite small. And it has a holder that holds the chip in. So you place the chip on the holder and then the stencil goes over the top. So again, to give us some idea of the size, the picture on the left there, that's the tip of a biro, and the larger ball of the two is a 0.8 millimeter ball, which is just standard for redoing the solder. The arrow pointed to the small ball was the 0.3 that we had to use for the situation. So quite small. Fun thing is they come in little glass jars with a plastic screw-on lid. The 0.1 mil, if you flip the jar over, flip it back again, they all roll out the threads onto the floor. So it's lots of fun to play with. So basically what you do is you've got to put the balls on there. Now, I don't know, I'm probably showing my age here. As a kid, you had the game where it had the little ball bearings inside and you have to move the ball bearings around into the holes. That's kind of this times 100. So the first thing we do was we put flux on the bottom of the chip. Now, the flux is basically just acting as a glue. So the idea is that when the balls go on there, it just kind of glues on. And then we put the chip into the holder and we align the stencil on top. So move it around so the holes are all lined up. Very first time we did this, because the balls are so small, there was a gap between the chip and the bottom of the stencil, so they all just ran out. So we had to use pieces of paper to actually lift the chip up close enough. So once we've done that, poured it on there, played the little game. Now the next fun part starts. The balls are so small that you could have 1 or 2 in each hole. So we had to make a decision whether we wanted 1 or 2 in each hole. Because if you have a combination of the two, as you imagine, if you've got 2 balls of solder on there, the bubble that they make will be actually larger than the others. So we decided we wanted to have 1 ball, mainly because there was beer involved and we were stupid. So we spent quite some time with a little picking the second ball out of just about all of them. So finally got that done, happy with ourselves, drunk too much beer. So now we have to solder on. So what we need to do now is we need to melt that solder. So this process is quite delicate because you have to heat the chip and the solder and everything quick enough so that the solder melts before the flux melts away, and because if you do it too slowly, the flux melts, the balls roll off. So the way we did that is we had a heating plate, so that the picture there with the yellow piece of the yellow is unheated, the stainless steel piece is heated up 260 degrees, and we just gently and smoothly slide the chip across the heating pad, and it's fast enough that the solder melts, and we were quite pleased with ourselves. It actually worked. So all done, looking good. There was an extra pieces of solder on the squares. They're actually there for manufacturing purposes, they're not used. So then we had to just clean everything off, clean off all the flux, but it all looked good. So we're actually quite pleased with ourselves at this point. So the next thing now, we've actually got to place this chip back onto the motherboard. This requires a special machine. So it's a placing machine. So just to go through some of the anatomy of the machine, the picture on the left there, you can see there's 6 arms, and the idea of those is they hold the board in place. So they're completely adjustable, and they'll hold the board nice and firmly in place. Below there is a square with a whole lot of round circles in there. That's actually the heat duct. So superheated here is blowing up through there, and that's actually what's going to melt the solder on the board from the underside. And the last picture, there's a black box at the top next to the screen. That is a camera and a series of prisms. And what it does is it allows you to see the top of the chip, the bottom of the chip, and the top of the board all at the same time, so you can line everything up. So first of all, we actually put the board in an oven for about a week to heat it up. We want to drive any moisture out because it's going to be heated so quickly and so hot that if there's any moisture in the board, it can actually cause it to bubble and break. And a lot of these boards, you have the tracks on the top, but there's actually multiple layers of tracks underneath, so to make it thinner. So you can have up to 8 tracks inside. So a little bit of tiny bit of moisture in there, if the board buckles just a little bit, it's going to break a track. So first of all, we mount the board, and you can see the picture on the left there, there's a little red laser dot. That's to help you align the board so that it's directly over the top of the heating element. We then just set the chip on top, we just get the orientation correct, so it's around the right way, and then we start the process. So the very first process, it shows that we have to align the machine to the chip. So the blue square is just basically a superimposed image. The round circle is actually the little suction cup that's going to pick up the chip for us. So first of all, we align that up so that the suction cup's right in the middle of the chip. The next thing here is we actually have to align it up to the board. So what we're actually looking at here is we're looking at the top of the chip, the bottom of the chip, and the top of the motherboard. It's kind of like a ghost chip in the middle there. And we have, yes, yeah, I was told to say that. And it wasn't one of Brandon's dad jokes either. So we had to line it up. So the idea is that because you can see the superimposed images, that you can see the image on the right, it's not quite lined up at this point. The dots aren't there. The image on the left, it's all nicely lined up. So once we've got that fine, the way we do that is a little joystick on the machine, and you can just spin the joystick, it turns the chip and moves it left and right. So once we've got that, push the button, it's going to drop the chip down onto the board. Now you have to be very careful at this point because it's basically going onto little lumps. So the first 3 times we tried this, each time we tried it, we dropped the chip down, and as soon as we let it go, the chip actually slid. So we had to, in the end, we had to re-clean everything and try and remove some of the lumps of solder before the 4th time round. And that meant we're starting from scratch each time. So realigning the chip to the holder, and then realigning the holder to the board. So once we've got to that point, sat down nicely, we thought, cool, then we start the heating process. So at this point, it starts blowing this superheated air up underneath the board, and we just had to watch the chip because we weren't quite sure what temperature to get to before everything was soldered in there. So we just have to wait and see the chip just relax onto the board. So we finally get done, cooled it all off, thought, yes, this is great. Reassembled the whole phone, put it all back together, put it onto charge, and it's dead. Yes. Oh. So we plugged it all in, and the phone's dead. We actually were checking out the board, and there's a couple of hot spots in there. So what went wrong? we could have overheated the board. So in the process of removing the chip or even putting it back on, we may have actually overheated the board and broken some chips. It may not have soldered correctly. We may have had some either short underneath or something just not quite in place. Or it just may have moved during the heating process. It could have actually just slid sideways and that. So we're kind of thinking, we've still got one spare chip. Still got one spare motherboard. We've still got an X-ray machine. So this is a to be continued. So basically the idea now is we're going to go through and try and finish this off. So our next steps is, we're going to X-ray it again just because we can and we have beer. We're then going to try and replace the chip. Well, we won't use the same chip and motherboard combination because we actually don't know which one of them is actually broken. So we're going to pull this off and start again. So that's kind of really the end of my speech. Some of the uses for this, because this is not really a security thing, I've tried to bring some of that in, is what we're doing here, we can actually use that to actually pull data off someone's phone. So if someone's got a broken phone or phone has been collected for some reason, there's no reason why we can't actually start pulling the data directly off the chips. Newer phones, a lot of it's encrypted on there, but most of your Android stuff, it's just sitting there. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.